Alright, we are halfway through the year of 2023 and so many amazing games have already been released. There are way too many to play them all, of course, but despite me trying to get a YouTube channel off the ground, which took a lot of my time, I was still able to play 9 newly released games. And today, I'll be ranking all of them in this tier list. I'll be going over the games in the order in which I played them. There are a few games that I wanted to play but didn't get around to, like Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Amnesia the Bunker, but as a dude with a full-time job, I just can't play them all. Let's jump straight into it with the first game I played this year, Dead Space. This is a remake of the very first horror game I ever played, so it was a hell of a nostalgia ride, and they absolutely nailed it. It's probably the most faithful from the ground up remake of a game I've ever seen. It retained the essence of the original in its complete form while modernizing it for next gen consoles. The improvements in the sound design, animation, environment design and gameplay are all stellar, and the game runs incredibly smooth on the PS5 and feels really polished. The necromorphs are as terrifying as I remember them. Their unscripted appearances create an intense and suspenseful gaming experience. And, it doesn't matter how many playthroughs you do, the suspense will keep being there. While the remake itself is flawless, I do have some complaints, but I had those complaints as well with the original game. Around 95% of the game takes place on the Ishin, and while it's now more explorable and less linear than it was in the original, it still feels somewhat repetitive in its environments. There's a lack of diversity, it's a little bit of a corridor simulator in a lot of ways. In terms of gameplay, you spend a lot of the game, doing the same thing, essentially. It's moving from point A to point B, and you shoot enemies in between. There's very minimal puzzle solving or other variations in the gameplay, but it's a 10-hour horror game. It doesn't overstay its welcome, so the core gameplay is great enough for it to be entertaining all the way through. Despite the mentioned minor gripes, I think Dead Space is an incredibly effective and a genuinely scary horror game, which is hard to find these days. I'm gonna place the game in the A tier. It doesn't quite reach the S tier because of the mentioned issues, but it's definitely a high A tier game. Next up, the controversial Harry Potter game. I must admit, I'm not a Harry Potter fan. In fact, I've only watched 2 movies, and I never touched the books, so I definitely didn't have the nostalgia glasses on while playing this game. Regardless of that, I had a good time with the game. I think the Hogwarts castle serves as an amazingly designed hub area. I found the combat system to be unique and different, making it a blast to learn on hard mode. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game played it somewhat safe when it came to the open world aspects, following the same repeated gameplay loop that is presented in countless other open world games of this genre. The typical strongholds to conquer, the map filled with collectibles and repetitive tasks to do became a bit tedious for me, but I'll admit that my fatigue with open world games in general might have influenced my perspective on this game, and I can't entirely blame that on the game itself. Additionally, I had hoped for a less scripted approach when it comes to attending classes in Hogwarts. I thought that was going to be more the focus of the game, and I was a little bit disappointed that the focus of the game wasn't that. It was more, your typical open world game stuff. I also wasn't that big of a fan of those crafting mechanics with those mobile game timers. It was a little bit weird. Yeah, I'm not a big fan. To sum it up, there were elements that I genuinely liked in this game, but overall it wasn't that memorable of an experience, so I'll put it in B tier. Alright, next up, the Final Fantasy music game, Theatrhythm Final Bar Line. I must confess I never played a rhythm game before this one, at least not on a console. However, after reading some positive reviews, on top of me being a huge Final Fantasy music nerd, who listens to the franchise's beautiful music whenever I'm working or doing something on my computer, I decided to give this game a chance, and I'm glad I did. The amount of pure joy I experienced listening to the various soundtracks of all the Final Fantasy games made it worthwhile, despite the rhythm gameplay being quite basic. But the game boasts an overwhelming amount of great music, and I have to admit, I couldn't even complete all of them. I only did the soundtracks of the games that I liked the most. One of the most enjoyable aspects of the game was also the online mode. mastering certain of your favorite Final Fantasy tracks, and then you can challenge other players, see who gets the highest score. It's pretty fun. It's a delightful little game to play in between all the high budget AAA behemoths. I'll put it in B tier. Next up, Like a Dragon Ishin, and spoiler alert, it's my least favorite Yakuza game. Despite being an Unreal Engine remake of a PS3 game, the remake still felt incredibly dated in my opinion. It just felt so stiff to play, especially when I'm used to the Dragon Engine games. Additionally, the story and characters failed to captivate me, kind of further adding to the slog that was getting through this game. I can't say though that I had no fun at all with this game. The sub-stories were again very cleverly written and they were fun to play through. There were some absolute gems in there. Moreover, there's also numerous side activities to enjoy in this game. Just like all the other Yakuza games, the open world is filled with these fun activities. There's also the farming side game, which was fun. It didn't quite reach the level of enjoyment the Cabaret side game or the management side games had in Yakuza 0 and Yakuza 7. But it was still decent, I enjoyed it. Overall, I'll place this game in C tier. I hope the next two games will impress me more. Considering they're back to the Dragon Engine, it seems like a guarantee fact to me. Alright, no beating around the bush for this one. Resident Evil 4 is an undeniable S tier. In my opinion, this remake not only surpasses the original, but also stands as the most fun Resident Evil game I have ever played. The improvements made to the story and characters are remarkable. Leon feels more grounded and realistically written, while at the same time maintaining the badass nature he had in the original. Ashley, who was an annoying damsel in distress character in the original, has been transformed into an actually good character. I don't know how they managed that. The game strikes a perfect balance between the cheesy horror of the original and the more grounded, scary horror of the more recent Resident Evil titles. It blended them perfectly. The graphics and art direction are the best in Resident Evil history, elevating the visual quality to new heights. Gameplay-wise, it's just an insanely fun game that doesn't get old. Taking out hordes of enemies makes you feel like an absolute badass, and the gameplay just flows incredibly smoothly. The consistent 60 frames per second and the bug-free experience definitely aid the enjoyment the game provides. The inventory management also adds that layer of strategy to the game that the other Resident Evils have as well. The game's pacing is fantastic, with a well-balanced mix of the enemy wave sections, the thrilling boss encounters, the puzzle solving, and even some open exploration segments. Each area, the village, the castle, and island offer a distinct and varied experience, ensuring there's always something exciting around the corner. On hard mode, the game took me around 22 hours to beat, and I wasn't bored a single moment during the entire playthrough. I could gush on about this game for hours, but I think I've said enough. It's a freaking masterpiece and easily deserved S tier. Metroid Prime Remaster. Having never played any of the Metroid Prime games before, I decided to give the remaster a shot, but it didn't quite win me over. The game design feels very 2010, makes sense, which can be appreciated since it doesn't hold your hand at all. It lets you freely explore the world on your own after a brief introduction. Due to this freedom, there's a lot of backtracking, as items, abilities, and new unlockable paths are scattered all over the world, and it's easy to miss them. Having to backtrack to previous areas can be a bit frustrating. On a personal note, I found Metroid Dread way more enjoyable. I prefer the 2D Metroidvania gameplay overall, and I found the boss fights to be more engaging in a 2D perspective. The boss battles in Metroid Prime, in comparison, felt very lackluster to me. Overall, it's not a bad game at all. I do acknowledge its qualities, not to mention that absolute banger of a soundtrack. I'm a real big fan of that. However, it simply doesn't fully align with my preferences. I'll place it in B tier. Alright, next up, Tears of the Kingdom, the game likely to be Game of the Year for 2023, and I can definitely see why. It's a remarkable improvement upon Breath of the Wild first of all. The game is way more interesting in my opinion because of Link's abilities. They're way more revolutionary, resulting in more captivating puzzles. Players can come up with whatever creative solutions they like, and that's just mind-blowing. making it the best sandbox or puzzle game that I have personally ever played. The dungeons and bosses in this game are also way better. They definitely listened to the feedback people had about Breath of the Wild. The addition of the Sky Islands was also a great move. The exploration in the sky felt incredible, really expanded the game's openness. The technical wizardry that is necessary to get this game running on a Switch is truly impressive. Now, is it a perfect game? I don't think so. And that mostly has to do, in my opinion, with the fact that they are reusing the same map from Breath of the Wild. Moreover, there's some complaints I had with Breath of the Wild that return here as well. For one, the storytelling is way too scattered in my opinion. There's only a little bit of story unfolding like every 5 hours you play, which is just not enough. I wildly prefer the more direct storytelling from the previous Zelda games over this current approach. I must admit though, I haven't finished this game yet. I've clocked in about 50 hours, but Diablo 4 and Final Fantasy 16 have pretty much taken most of my time these last few months. So I do plan on completing the game at some point this year, so my opinion may improve or lessen based on that, but as of now, I think the game is an A-tier game. It's a fantastic game, just not a perfect one. Next up is Diablo 4, which happens to be my very first ARPG experience. The game's art direction, music, and overall design are incredible, especially for someone like me who's really into horror. The atmosphere is spot on, the voice acting is stellar, and it has a pretty decently written narrative. The gameplay is initially very enjoyable, but it does become somewhat repetitive after a while. I mean, many players invest thousands of hours in these types of games, but they're essentially just beating the same enemies over and over and over again. I personally struggle to see the appeal. It boils down to just doing the same thing over and over, slaying hordes of enemies, completing fetch quests, facing the same bosses again and again. There's no real variation in gameplay here. The most enjoyable aspect for me was creating a build and experimenting with various combinations and abilities to maximize your damage output. However, towards the end of the game, there's an overwhelming amount of grinding necessary to just make tiny improvements to your build. I just don't have the patience for it. Despite this, I still recognize Diablo 4 is exceptionally well made. The campaign was fun, the rush of fighting a world boss was also undeniable, but after a while it's just, you're just doing the same thing over and over, it just loses its charm. All things considered, it's just not really my cup of tea, but I see it's well made. I'll place it in B tier. Final Fantasy 16 is up last, and what an adrenaline-filled rollercoaster ride of a game this is. The combat system surpassed my expectations in every way. It's a blend of Devil May Cry and the modern day God of War gameplay. It offered a fun experience, and you can experiment with so many different abilities and builds and combos to find your most effective strategies. The game is quite unique and often feels like an arcade game to me. It has a linear structure to its missions, featuring tons of skippable cutscenes, lots and lots of mini bosses, and almost always a final epic fight at the end. Sometimes the final fight even has its own control scheme, adding to that arcadey feeling the game has. I freaking loved these fast-paced and exciting moments, especially when accompanied with unbelievably hype music by the legend himself, Soken. Beyond the linear missions, the game also includes semi-open world areas with lore and downtime moments, and they do provide that needed variety in between the hype-filled missions. While the side content may seem a bit lackluster, especially at the beginning of the game, it significantly improves as you progress, providing fantastic character resolutions to nearly every character in the game at the end. This added depth makes the game much richer than if you would solely focus on the main story. However, it's not all rainbows and sunshine. The game does have some issues, with the RPG elements in the game feeling quite bare bones. The weapon and armor crafting in particular is extremely mundane, as you can only craft one weapon at a time in the story. Dialogue options are also very limited. There's not much choices to be made at all. It's a very streamlined, presented experience, so if you're looking for a deep RPG experience, this might not be the game for you. Despite these issues, what makes this game so great anyway is that it absolutely knows where its priorities lie. Boasting a great combat system towards the end, amazing boss encounters, and a soundtrack that keeps you hyped in true Final Fantasy fashion. The story is also solid. Final Fantasy XVI is an undeniable high A tier. So this is my tier list for the first half of 2023. I'll complete the tier list once we're at the end of the year with the remaining titles I'll still be playing. What do you think of this tier list? Is it great or complete trash? What would your 2023 tier list be like? Leave a comment down below, I love going through them every single time. Thank you for watching and catch you all in the next video.